animals were living in Sky World, in Galuntai. But gradually they realized that this space was becoming very, very full and overcrowded. They looked over the edge of the Sky World and they saw water all around underneath them. They were thinking if they could just have some land on the water, maybe they could move there. After a while, they sent Dionisi, Beaver's grandchild, this is the diving beetle as we know it today, to have a look. And the diving beetle, Dionisi, goes down and he scatters all over the water looking for land, can't find any. They're wondering what to do. And eventually, Dionisi will dive onto the water and he comes back up from the base of the water's land, if you want, and he starts with a little bit of mud and starts spreading it all over and creating the world in which we live today. When it had been there for a while, the people are ready to move, the animals are ready to move down. They try to fly down and they notice that it's still sticky and gooey and they can't live there. So what they do, they send the giant buzzard, this bird here, who's the grandfather of all buzzards we know today. He is huge. He's got a wingspan of 40, 50, 60 feet, a massive buzzard. Is the great buzzard of all time. And what they will do, they instruct the giant buzzard, the great buzzard, to fly all around the world, keeping low to the ground so that his wings, when they're flapping, will create an airflow to dry out the earth so they can land on it. This he does, and he flies all around the world. When he comes back to the Appalachians, of course, he's been flying for a long, long, long time, and he's very tired. And his wings start to hit the ground where they make valleys and then flick up and make great mountains. The animals realize and scream down, stop, stop, come back up here. We don't want to have to walk up and down hill all the time. But if you go to the Cherokee homeland today, it is the Appalachian Mountains, some of the highest mountains east of the Mississippi. And this explains where they come from. Once that land was dry, the animals came down and they decided they needed warmth and light. It was still dark. So they took the sun and they set it to move from east to west. But the sun at that height, where it was initially, was too close and too hot. And Chaskagari, the crawfish, he got his body burnt by the sun. And to this day, the Cherokee will not eat red crawfish. They think it was damaged by the sun. Gradually, over time, they arranged to have the sun taken up higher and higher until it
Sorry,
and each day.
Sorry,
yeah, you went. I think that
you just were muted. We just need individuals to mute. Apologies. Sorry, I think you got muted by mistake there, Ian. Sorry.
That's fine. So they got him on the seventh height, and each day the sun would come underneath.
Is totally amateurish.
And then across the top at night to lead to darkness. So this is where they came from. This is where they lived, and the extent of area they hunted.
Why they?
Okay, so they lived in this area. Their main area was here along the Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina border, but they hunted over a much grander area. They shared this land with other people, but they hunted in that area. The Cherokee, their homes are divided into three primary areas: the Overhill, the Lower Towns, and the Middle and Valley Towns. These three areas are mutually understandable, but they have fairly strong dialectical and linguistic differences over certain things. They're all inheritable and may marry within each other, but there are differences in the language and some of the structures of society. They're based on 7 clan members, 7 clan groups. Originally, there were 8 clans, and the 8 left the humans to become bears, to deal with a situation of friction that had dealt up. So that is why we are 7 clans of Cherokee today: the paint, the bird, the blue, the deer, the wild potato, the wolf, and the long hair. They're all represented in different ways, whether it be in masks or through the animals or through the plants that they come through. But everyone is descended from one of these 7 original clans. The Cherokee are a matrilineal group where your descent comes from your mother, your clan identity comes from your mother, and you can follow down. So here again, we have 7 women with the masks above their head, showing which clan they represent. And this led to some interesting interaction and comments. Atakulakula, or the little carpenter, as he becomes known in English, was in negotiations with the British in the 18th century. And he stated, it's customary for us to have women at our councils when we're talking to you. As white people are also born of women, why on earth don't you have half of your population involved in any negotiations as well? A question that is possibly still be asked today by several people. But they are a female-led group. The centre of all life is the council house. This is a 7-sided building, 1 side for each clan, and every member of the village or the town they live in would be involved in that discussion, young to old. Nobody's excluded. So these things could become 300-400 feet across for a large village, very big. At the front, this area here is where the town standard, sort of a marker of who they were, would be. And at the rear of the council house would be the treasury house, and everybody who grows food, corn, whatever other crops, or gets meat would donate it, a percentage of it, to the council house treasury. And then that is there as a reserve if anyone begins to struggle, or if guests come in and they need to be looked after, they have this space behind them to use. I want to go back now to the language and OCO and the other languages the words that I began with. Around 1810, this gentleman, Sequoyah, decided that the power of the written word was something the Cherokee could not do without. He went off and spent several years alone and came back with a syllabary, very similar to an alphabet, but each phrase or sound would have an identifying mark. So very, very similar to alphabet, and often called an alphabet, but it's slightly different. Very quickly, the entire Cherokee nation learned to read and write in its own language. They began printing a bilingual newspaper in English and Cherokee. This is what the Cherokee alphabet, the Cherokee syllabary looks like. And I said at the beginning that CWY was the word for Cherokee. We can see where this comes and how this comes by following it through. We split up the word. It's Salagi for the Cherokee. If we split that up into its 3 breaks, we get Salagi. If we look on here, where the red square has popped up, we've got the C for Sa. You have the W for La, and the Y is the sound Gi. You put them together, you have Salagi. I also mentioned Cherokee for hello, OCO. You split it out like this, and this time it will be in green, not in red. Yeah, that symbol for the O, the B sort of symbol for the C, and then the H symbol for the Yo. So if you were to write hello in Cherokee, that would be the symbol for it. So this is how their language works, and they became very quickly they became strong with this. And this language is still being taught regularly in the schools. In fact, if you use a Word program on your PC, you can go in and change the language to Cherokee so that you can type in the Cherokee language and send messages, write documents in Cherokee. iPhone is also another place where Cherokee is a language that can be selected to use, so it stays around. And now I want to look a little bit at the historical context, beginning a little bit further back than I'm going to focus on, but beginning and looking at Thomas Jefferson. In the first treaty that the Americans make with the Delawares after the Revolution, they promised to respect all the treaties and all the agreements they make. But Jefferson is also planning to take their land, and he's planning in two specific ways to do this. First is trade. Secondly is might, strength. So, turning to trade first, Jefferson will write at one stage that we shall push them to have debts in our trading houses, because we find once they have debts that they can't pay as individuals, they will come together and lop off land to give us for our use. So he's using debt to adapt and to pull the, I'm going to put it, to pull land into themselves. The second way he does it is by might. On the frontier, there is very little control over violence. Leads often to warfare. Then the army will step in to make peace, and as part of the peace treaty, there is a land cession that comes on as well. During his presidency, using these two methods, Jefferson was able to take about 200,000 square miles off different native peoples in about 9 different states for the US. The next big push for moving the Cherokee comes with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson's born in the South, he knows these people, but in his State of Union, he will say, what good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, etc., etc., contrasting the heathenish savages who just run around in the forest with the civilized Europeans, and that because of this reason we have to move the Native Americans, particularly the Cherokee. Now, these are the sort of civilized houses that he's talking about. However, these are Cherokee houses. They were not running around in the forest. Not every Cherokee lived in a house like this, but many did. And Andrew Jackson knows this because he grew up around them. This is the printing press where they printed the Cherokee Phoenix, the bilingual newspaper. To say, Jackson knows this, but in order to push them off their land, he has to portray them as savage so that people will agree with him. And what we've seen is a shift through, I think, Jefferson, who thought they were inferior, but maybe we could improve them, where by the time you get to Jackson, these people just are savage, will always be savage, and have to be moved. The Cherokee reacted to some of these changes that are coming on. They start bringing in written laws. They start to use some of their time to match and to marry what they see in American society, thinking this will give them a degree where the white people will accept them for who they are. They bring in a police force, they bring in business and ferries and that they can charge to do that. They also bring in new laws to control clan revenge. They set up a bicameral system of government. They have a judiciary. It's very, very similar, but it's all twisted through a Cherokee understanding. So symbolically, it looks very similar to the American government, but there are slight differences within it, which means it's still acceptable to the Cherokee. There are also other factors pressing on to the Cherokee, as well as Jackson. Population increase. Ohio, Tennessee, and Georgia, three areas that the Cherokee engage and spread with, had a population of about 40,000 in 1810. By 1830, that's up to about 2 million. So you do have the real physical presence that people need space, and they're putting pressure on. All of these states, as well as the Cherokee, had other nations as well within them. Georgia, however, becomes the most determined to get rid of Indians whenever it can. There are short-term immediate reasons. The Cherokee are living in good land. They do well with farming and other pursuits. They also find gold in Cherokee land. Whenever you find gold, you want to move other people off it so you can have it. There are also political reasons that relate to the interaction between the state and the federal government. All the states agree to sell some of their surplus land to the government so that the government could then sell it on at a profit to make money for the country, to have a starting base of a financial system. Georgia sold all its land, and in return, the US government would pledge to buy all Indian land back for Georgia. Georgia is really upset because it's not getting this darn land that it's been promised. Complains and complains and complains. The US government says, we want to buy it, but we can only buy it by treaty. We have to follow on the respect that Cherokees has of a sovereign state, and if they don't want to sell it, we can't force to buy it. And the Cherokees constantly said, no, we like where we live. It's where we've always lived. We make a good living. We don't want to sell. This doesn't prove to be satisfactory for Georgia. So Georgia starts pushing and prodding and trying to break the cohesiveness of the Cherokee and somehow force them to move. Initially, what they do is they gather a number of Cherokee, people who are fairly well respected but don't represent the whole community. And it gets them to sign a treaty selling some land in return for other land further west. Now, there is a debate still going on to the day about how responsible these people are for the final removal of the Cherokee. To a certain degree, these people believed that it was going to happen. There's nothing they could do to stop it, so they might as well take the best deal for the people. None of the people involved in this profited individually. They got land which they hoped the Cherokee would come on. But the vast majority of Cherokee did not want to move. They pushed on this and challenged it. We're talking somewhere in the region of 18,000 Cherokees against moving compared to about 2,000 wanting to move. So 20,000 in all, roughly, vast majority want to stay. There are also a series of legal challenges that the Cherokee put in and take all the way to the Supreme Court to try and defend their land. They get defeated in a couple of cases, but the final challenge, Worcester v. Georgia, is one they are able to win. Georgia passes a law that says any non-native person who goes into Cherokee land must have a license from the Georgia government in order to do that. Several missionaries, including Samuel Ost in Worcester, who were working with the Cherokee, say, we're not going to do it. You do not have any authority on what goes on in the Cherokee Nation, therefore we don't need to buy a license of the state of Georgia to be here. When they refuse, Georgia militia rides in, kidnaps them, puts them in chains and takes them back and charges them. And what happens, the Cherokee realize that now, if they can take this case, it won't be Indian against white person, it will be white person against white person. And that may get more traction in the courts, and indeed it does. The Supreme Court will finally rule that the Cherokee Nation are a separate political nation that could not be controlled by the state, but had a relationship with the federal government that was equal to that of the state relationship with the federal government. I will be out of the law soon, trust me. And that the states cannot do anything. But this didn't suit everybody. So the Supreme Court has made a decision. Andrew Jackson, my least favorite president, would say to them, say to the people in Georgia, go and light a fire under them. They'll soon move. He's reported to have said, Chief Justice Marshall has made his law, now let him enforce his law. He's the only sitting president to ever ignore a ruling by the Supreme Court. So, I now want to move on to what comes next, which is the forced removal, or I usually refer to it as the ethnic cleansing of the Cherokee. This is a quote from a military officer who traveled with the Cherokee on the removal. Murder is murder and somebody must answer because of the death and destruction that he saw because of this movement. The Cherokee call the removal Nunandol Suni, which literally translates to the trail where they cried or the Trail of Tears. So it's the Trail of Tears that we're going to be talking about. The Cherokee weren't the only people to be removed. As you can see from this map, the Cherokee are coming from here and moving forward. There are other people moving from the north and other people. But the Cherokee, with their access to the Supreme Court, with their ability in there, become the most well-known and almost sort of the poster child for every nation. Every nation has its own horror story to tell. The Cherokee sort of become the national story in some ways. It begins in 1830s, where, not 30s, when the assembly begins. Now, Jackson has said that there aren't enough army officers to protect the Cherokee from the Georgians. But suddenly there are enough American military to round up every single Cherokee from their homes, and they're only allowed to take what they can grab and carry on their backs at that time. There are a few officials who would allow them a little longer to pack a few bags if they could, but they were very quickly moved on. They were then taken into what were cattle stockades to wait until the government had organized their move. The first group go off in the middle of the summer. It's really nice weather. They're moving across, but word quickly gets back that people are dying of summer diseases. So John Ross, the leader of the Cherokee, steps in and says, please let us organize it. And they let him. He holds them back a little bit, and they live in what become terrible conditions in the stockade, but they're able to avoid the worst of the diseases, and they leave a little bit later on in the year, into the autumn. Plenty of time to move across and travel into their new lands. Against their will, but they're still going. The only problem is nobody could have foretold that this would be one of the hardest winters in memory in America. They end up getting trapped between rivers that are frozen over and have all sorts of problems and difficulties, and people start to fade and to die. One New England preacher who saw them on the Trail of Tears would write, about 2,000 people, sick and feeble, many near death. One woman was carrying her youngest child who was dying in her arms. Multitudes go on foot, even aged females traveling with heavy burdens on sometimes frozen ground, with no covering for their feet except what nature had given them. Barefoot over ice, snow, and sludge. At times, the column of people was 3 or 4 miles long. Some people were willing to help them when the food started to get low. Others just increased their prices 10, 20-fold, knowing they have a captive audience. The preacher would go on to say, the Indians buried 14 or 15 people every time they stopped, who had died or would die in the evenings throughout the day. I will leave the words of a modern day Cherokee to explain how they view this now.
The United States gained a lot of land and farms and taverns and ferries and things like that. But a loss for the American government is in the 1830s to the southeastern Indians, it's ethnic cleansing.
So, I'm sorry if that sound didn't work perfectly for you, but he's basically saying that the death was horrendous and that it's a stain on the history of America, that they were prepared to pull away and to drag apart these people, and referring it to ethnic cleansing. The ordeal didn't end on arrival, as you can imagine. If you're suffering malnutrition and disease as you're traveling, when you stop, you don't instantly become healthy and well again. And people would be losing their lives for a year or two after, is directly related to it. If we look on the long term, probably somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 Cherokee in total out of that 20,000 will have died. That number is contested. People look at the numbers that happened on the trail, which is down to about 3 to 4. But once you add in the fact that the people would be very, very weak when they get to that location, and disease lingers, weakness would linger. And I think it's better to count the upper number on that. Where are we today after this horrible movement and this ethnic cleansing of the Southeast, amongst other places? The Cherokee population is about 350,000, slightly under, bigger than the city of Cambridge, where I'm sitting at the moment. This makes them one of, if not the largest tribal nation in the US today. They're primarily based in Tahlequah in Oklahoma. That's where the majority of them were, where they were taken during removal. There are still a number, a growing number, who live on the Qualla boundary in North Carolina, in Cherokee, North Carolina. The Cherokee Nation government in both locations, just like the US, still has legislative, executive, and judicial, like the United States. They have a lot more authority and power over themselves today than they have for many years. In Oklahoma, where the majority of Cherokees are, who are living on a tribal base, they operate Cherokee Nation businesses, various different businesses, from the standard image of casinos through to manufacturing and other items. They employ about 11,000 people in Oklahoma. And they contribute somewhere in the region of $2.16 billion to the Oklahoma economy every year. So they've turned around this horrific ethnic disruption, dislocation, and cleansing to now be one of the largest employers in their region and to contribute massive amounts of money to the state itself. And that's where I'll leave you. I hope that made sense to you all, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Ian, thank